My grandmother left everything to me: house, accounts, a small stock portfolio, the little ring she'd worn for 50 years, and when the lawyer handed me the envelope with her neat looping handwriting on the outside, the room felt like it tilted. That sentence sounds simple, but the truth is messy, because the moment her will named me as sole beneficiary, a slow, furious campaign began to try to erase me from the family story. They tried to rewrite history, forge my absence, gaslight me out of what was rightfully mine. They failed. This is how they tried and how I refused to be erased. My grandmother's house smelled like lemon oil and old pages. It was small and stubborn like her. When she called me to say she'd drawn up a new will, I didn't understand why she'd do such a thing while she was still lively enough to tell jokes about her knitting. But she did. She'd been organizing her affairs, she said, and she wanted everything to go to me because I had spent the most time with her these past years, because I'd been the one who sat with her on cold nights and fetched her glasses when she misplaced them, because she liked that I listened. I loved her in a way that is hard to describe without losing the tender edges. She was sharp, opinionated, and the kind of woman who could be wickedly funny and fiercely protective. People tended to underestimate her because she knitted and because her hands trembled sometimes. They didn't know how stubborn and exact she could be when it came to making a decision. When she wrote that will, she did it carefully. She signed in blue ink, witnessed twice, notarized. The paperwork was plain, legal, and resolute. The day the lawyer read the will out loud, I remember air going thin in my chest. Relatives shifted in their seats. Some faces smiled like they were grateful. Others tightened. You could feel the economy of expectation changing in real time. Quietly, the document said, "I leave all my property, accounts, and personal effects to my granddaughter Anna." The lawyer stopped to make sure everyone heard the clarity of those words. No ambiguity. No conditional clauses. No hidden trusts. Just that one plain sentence that would mean everything. Outside, my family clustered in the small lobby talking in groups. People said polite things about how she must have been thinking of me, about how it was only right she gave the things to someone who'd been there. But some of the words were not polite. They were the quieter sort of hunger. "We thought she'd leave us something," said a cousin. "It's sudden," said an aunt with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You could see the gears working behind the smiles, the calculations about inheritance, the mental inventory of what could be taken. That was my first warning. Warning turned into pressure. The texts arrived in the days after the reading, questions that were practicized at first. "Are you sure she was okay when she signed that? Did you influence her? Have you thought about sharing?" They sound like concern until you see how often the word share is used when it should be fairness. An aunt dropped by unannounced. A cousin called to check on grandma, and spent most of the visit asking where important documents were, just to help organize. Small hands at small windows. Then the campaign escalated. A quiet, confident man came to the house purporting to be a friend of the family. He carried paperwork that looked official, letterhead, stamps, the sort of thing you glance at and accept. He suggested gently that there might be earlier wills, older documents, paperwork that could complicate matters. He wanted to help make things right. Behind him, voices at church grew loud in their sympathy. A rumor started. "Maybe she wasn't of sound mind when she signed that one for you." Friends of friends called to say they'd seen Grandma confused on Sunday. It was a slow fog of doubt aimed at me. The idea was to make the signature appear shaky, the intent unclear, to make everyone around my grandmother believe she'd been coerced. First my reaction was simple shock. Then it turned into a practical kind of anger, the kind that is clean and directs your hands. I began collecting everything I could think of that tied my grandmother's will to her intention. I drove back to her house with boxes and scanned documents for hours. I gathered bank records, medical notes, letters she'd written to me over the years, every appointment notice, and crucially, the napkin on which she'd once scribbled a recipe the week before she finalized the will. It sounds strange, but the small things matter in probate. Dates, signatures, habitual handwriting. I had 2 years of grocery lists where she'd written with the same tilt and pressure that the will showed. It became obvious in those small lines that this woman knew what she was doing. Alongside gathering documents, I kept an archive of witnesses. Grandma had a wide social circle. Neighbors, the pharmacist, the woman at the church who came every Tuesday to play dominoes. They corroborated everything. Grandma had told the same story, unprompted, many times, about how she wanted her home to go to the person who had been with her the longest, the person who'd baked her cakes and wiped her brow. There were notes in her own handwriting about having Anna come live closer, written months before she updated the will. Witnesses don't always seem heroic, but in court they become the bones around which truth rests. When the first attorney representing the relatives filed a petition claiming undue influence and questioning her mental capacity, I thought my chest would cave in. They asserted that because my grandmother had mild memory lapses in the evenings, the whole document could be invalid. They pointed at the tremor in her hand during her last Christmas dinner, as if that was all the proof they needed. They tried to convert affection into suspicion, and suddenly everyone was debating whether warm evenings by the parlor lamp meant she'd been incapable of rational thought. I kept my voice steady. I kept my records clean. I hired a lawyer who specialized in elder law and probate. I remember him tapping at the printed will and saying, "They'll use every gap in memory as a chisel if you let them. We'll build a response out of documents and people who actually lived with her." He was careful but fierce, the tone I needed. The relatives pushed harder. They suggested alternate wills that supposedly had been signed decades ago. Vague things, poorly copied statements with faded ink that had suddenly become very relevant. They suggested that my grandmother had been susceptible to suggestion, especially from me, who visited so often. The insinuation was ugly and personal. It implied I had cultivated her mind into a decision that benefited me. There's something disorienting about being accused of convincing someone you love to favor you. It felt like being accused of rewriting the past. So I responded with calendars, with photographs, with time-stamped receipts. I asked the bank to provide transfer histories and photos from their records showing who had accessed accounts. I asked a handwriting analyst, an expensive step but necessary, to compare the will to diaries and letters my grandmother had written in the last 10 years. The analyst's report did not dance around. He showed, in charts and close-up photos, that the signature was wholly consistent with her written habits. The pressure points and pen lifts lined up. It was not forged. It was hers. Meanwhile, the family rhetoric shifted in tone. Publicly they were sorrowful, but behind closed doors they plotted. They tried to contact community members who had influence. Flyers appeared in the grocery store accusing me of being ungrateful, of isolating grandma. It was low and effective. Humans believe stories easy as water. A lie repeated in a dozen voices begins to feel like truth. That was their plan. Flood the social pond with a smell of doubt until people tasted it as fact. I kept walking softly through it, answering emails, taking sworn statements from neighbors, noting dates and times. I would sit in a church parking lot and make calls. I would drive to the pharmacy and ask the pharmacist if he remembered who brought in the will and why. He'd always say yes. That slice of normal, of the life we'd lived with grandma's routine, became crucial in anchoring the narrative. I had to be meticulous and calm, because the family's strategy relied on chaos and the natural human attraction to drama. Then came the nastier moves. Someone produced a photocopy of a will they claimed existed from 10 years prior. The copy was messy, ink blotchy at places that looked convenient. It had no notary stamp. The signatures were smeared. It was sloppy in a way that screamed desperation. Their lawyer filed it anyway, and suddenly it was an exhibit in the case. The court calendar grew teeth. I remember the day the hearing was scheduled, a room full of people with different versions of who our grandmother had been. The cousins who had been quiet on the phone now sat in the plaintiff section looking like they had a moral right to anger. At the hearing, my lawyer walked me through everything with a calm repetition that steadied me. We will show capacity at the time of signing. We will show that she was not coerced. We will show witnesses. Bring your records. Don't let them make this about your emotions. Make it about facts. So facts I brought. Receipts for the groceries I'd bought and the dates. A ledger of visits. The notarized will itself. Call logs showing times of calls made to and from grandma. A voicemail where she clearly dictated, "Anna, make sure you get the book in my cabinet." That matched her cadence. And the handwriting analyst testified with photos and magnifications, showing how the strokes matched the signature she'd used when she first bought the house, when she wrote checks, when she sent letters. The defense tried to poke holes. They pointed to a day she'd forgotten the name of a common neighbor. But forgetfulness alone doesn't erase a person's intent. It was a painful distinction for people to understand who hadn't sat with her, who hadn't held her hand as she signed the documents. The judge listened. I watched his face, which stayed neutral and careful, and then he leaned forward and asked specific questions that the defense couldn't easily answer. Outside the courthouse, the whispers continued, so I doubled down on one thing the relatives forgot: community. The neighbors who had eaten my grandma's stews, the delivery driver who'd joke with her, the little boy who learned to plant bulbs in her front garden. They knew the rhythm of our lives. The defense's story that she had been isolated and coerced felt thin against the weight of those memories. People had been in the house with me. People had heard the pronouncements she made aloud. "Anna, you are my girl." People could testify to her mental clarity in the weeks and months surrounding the will. What I learned in those courtroom weeks is how tribe works. People will rally for narrative unless there's a living, breathing contradiction. I invited the truth into the public record, and it has a unique stubbornness. The more I made the real details visible, the harder it was for false versions to hold. There was a particularly ugly moment when a relative tried to pull me into a public argument about the will at a family gathering they'd insisted I attend. I remember standing beneath a ceiling fan that hummed like static, while they accused me of being greedy for questioning the family. My grandma sat at the side watching. She looked tired not because of the fight, but because of the weight it put on everyone she loved. I realized then that the fight wasn't just legal. It had become moral theater for them. If they could make me seem selfish, why not pillage the public sympathy along with the estate? So I stopped attending those engineered family discussions. I let them argue in public and used my energy for record-keeping and witness gathering. Each time they raised the volume in the court of social opinion, I kept lowering it in the court of law with documents. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. The relatives, frustrated that their social tactics weren't working, tried something more overt. They took their complaints to the bank and demanded access to Grandma's accounts on the basis that she was incapacitated. That was a dangerous move. Banks are conservative with access, but they also hate ambiguity, and a half-formed story with vocal family members can make committees nervous. So I brought the bank the notarized will, the medical records showing competence at the time of signing, and a list of the people who had seen my grandmother make the decision. The branch manager, who'd known her for years, had a quiet authority. He wrote a letter confirming that he'd seen her in good spirits when she made changes, that she'd always come to him personally. That letter was the kind of small, steady thing that cuts the wings off a rumor. The relatives then stirred up older family tensions. They suggested this was about who had been favored historically, who got more attention, who had been given more at family events. They dredged up petty old grievances and slotted those old hurts into a narrative that made me the target. The favored one, the one who took. But again, their narrative fell apart when met with the straightforward timeline I'd constructed. The grandmother who had been sharp and decisive had chosen me. That was her right. In the middle of it all, I had nights where the betrayal felt like a physical thing lodged in my chest. A stone of cold and hurt. It sat there during moments that should have been ordinary. Folding laundry, watering the plant she'd given me. But even grief has a schedule in crises. You mourn and then you survey. You pick up pieces to confirm. You file. You go to the hearing, and you speak with a voice that is steadier as each day passes. The crucial pivot occurred when the defense attempted to introduce an old, ambiguous document that even they hadn't fully authenticated. Their lawyer was slick, but his paper was thin. During cross-examination, my lawyer got him to admit that the signatures on the older papers had gaps where ink had run, where the age of the paper didn't match the date claimed, where there were no valid witnesses recorded. Doubts in court have a practical quality. They demand documentation. The defense couldn't produce the registry receipt from the notary's office for that document. They couldn't produce bank stamps that confirmed the date. They had a copy and a story. We had original filings, witnesses, and an analyst. The balance tipped back toward the weight of verifiable truth. By the time the judge rendered his decision, which I'll remember like a sound I can't forget, he ruled that the will was valid. He found that my grandmother had sufficient capacity, and that there was no credible, verifiable evidence of undue influence. It felt like light after long rain. It felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for too long, and let a clean wind move through. But legal victory wasn't an end. It was a beginning of repair. The relatives who had fought so loudly now had to face a roster of very public consequences. Their challenge failed, and the court statement was clear. Not every bridge mended, of course. Some relationships remain fragile or broken. Some family members who had been aggressive drifted away, either in shame or stubbornness. That was their choice, not mine. What surprised me after the case was how tenderly some people reached out. The neighbor who kept her spare sugar in Grandma's tin came by with a pie and loaves of bread. The pharmacist greeted me with a nod like someone who'd quietly taken sides without making noise. The child who'd been learning to plant bulbs with my grandma brought me a drawing of the house with flowers on the lawn. Those small gestures mattered more than the loud declarations of relatives who never showed up. They were real. They were the form of support that had actual weight. I remember walking into the house alone after the legal dust cleared, and sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother. She had a softness in her eyes I'd not seen when we were in the center of the fight, relief that the chaos had subsided. She reached across and took my hand in hers, and for a moment the past months fell away. She said, "I knew you would be steady." Her voice was small and dry with age, but her smile was fully hers. No one could take that small corner of truth away. It was forever ours. We spent afternoons rebuilding the rituals that matter. We rearranged photographs, laughed about times when she'd insisted on adding an extra cup of sugar to the jam, and I taught her how to order certain meds online so she wouldn't have to worry about running out. She liked the little Powhatan tea I'd bring. She liked the sound of rain on the roof. We fixed the steel on the back gate together, and she told jokes as we tightened the screws. Those small domestic scenes, fragile and humble, were the real aftermath. The quiet reclamation of life that the court couldn't write but the heart knows. The relatives tried to erase me by filling the air with doubt, by distributing old resentment, by manufacturing papers and leaning on people's sympathy. But hope is a stubborn thing. Law is slow but it is sturdy. Truth perseveres when matched with documentation and witnesses who lived the life you claim. I learned more than legal tactics. I learned about the anatomy of a smear campaign, the way whispers build into consensus if left unchallenged, and the odd moral courage it takes to stand still while others shout. The concise truth that sat at the center of this whole mess is this: blood does not obligate you to accept theft or lies. Family bones do not come with a consent to be swallowed. My grandmother decided to leave her things to me because I had been her companion and her confidant, and that was her right. Relatives can try to gnaw at that right, to make you question yourself, to flood a room with doubt. They can try to erase you from the story, but the pen that writes the truth is heavier, eventually, than the rumor mill. They failed because we had facts, witnesses, and a woman who remembered what she wanted with crystalline clarity. Months after the court case, the house still stands with its lemon oil smell, and its loose step in the back porch that my grandmother insists makes the wind sound right. We've planted bulbs that will bloom next spring. We look at photographs and remember the simple goodness of the life she made. When the neighborhood kids shout on the sidewalk, she still waves at them in the way only she can, like they are the heroes of some small, perfect story. I learned in the middle of this fight that the quiet work matters more than the noisy performance. The receipts, the timestamps, the neighbors' memories, those boring, ordinary things are the scaffolding of truth. If you've ever been sidelined, doubted, or accused by people who should love you, learn this: document. Keep the small papers. Write down dates. Ask witnesses to make short notes. Guards the mundane. It is the most useful armor. My grandmother kept one tiny rule about the house: never cover the kitchen table with anything you won't want for a long time. She said the table remembers. She meant the table remembers the conversations, the spilled tea, the laughter and the fights. I sat at that table one evening and thought about how memory and paper had carried us through. The will, the signatures, the stacks of evidence. All of it had been her final conversation with the world. She had spoken plainly and with intent. People tried to rewrite that conversation, to add pages the woman never wrote. They failed because the truth exists in the small, boring things. The hospital receipts, the grocery list where she wrote, "Anna Honey" at the top. The voicemail where she told a neighbor to tell me to bring her knitting needles. Those things matter. They bear witness in ways that gossip cannot. So the house remained ours. The accounts stayed where she wanted them. The ring, the little dented circle she always wore, rested in my drawer. She touched it sometimes and laughed at its familiar weight. She taught me one more lesson in that time: that inheritance is not merely money or property. It's responsibility. It's the choice to honor a life by living honestly, and by protecting the story she chose to tell. There are people who will test you. They will try to erase you. They will push convenient versions of the past like cheap wallpaper, hoping to hide the real architecture. You can fight with noise and anger, or you can fight with patience and documents. Walk toward the latter and it will hold. The law is slow and blunt sometimes, but when matched with fact and community, it becomes an ally. I still drive by the grocery store where the flyers appeared and watch faces shift. Some of the people who stood with the relatives blink now in the sunlight and remember. The truth has a quiet evening ritual. It reappears in small acts of kindness, in neighbors who bring over pies, in children who plant bulbs. Those things are not dramatic. They are persistent. They are the slow rain that erodes the rumor mill. My grandmother passed away 2 winters after the case closed. We buried her in the cemetery where the azaleas faced the road. People who had been loud in that small storm came, some with shame on their faces, some with awkward politeness. But the people who mattered, the neighbors, the kid with the bulbs, the pharmacist, they were there with tears and steady hands, carrying the truth in ordinary ways. Casseroles, folded blankets, remembered recipes. The funeral was small and honest. It was what she would have wanted. Afterwards, in the quiet that follows funerals, I sat in the living room and touched the ring she'd left me. It rattled like a small bell in my palm. I thought about every step that had led us here. The reading in the lawyer's office, the whispers, the photocopies, the courtroom images, the long lists of receipts and phone records. I thought of the quiet neighbors and the pharmacist who wrote a short note to the judge. I thought about how small things had kept us afloat. No one should have to be erased to make someone else feel entitled. No one should have to fight your life into existence with receipts and witness statements, but sometimes you do. In those times you learn a certain craft. How to keep the boring paper tidy, how to make a timeline that tells a story without theatrics, how to call the pharmacist and ask him to confirm that your grandmother paid her bills the way she always had, how to get a handwriting analyst to compare a signature and point at the pen lifts like proof that a life was intentionally recorded. When I close the kitchen drawer where the ring rests, I feel like the house remembers too. The lemon oil, the photographs, the chairs with their worn spots, the back gate that springs in the wind. All of it is testimony. People who wanted to erase a life tried to color over the handwriting of a woman who had chosen me. They failed because the handwriting was hers, and the record was stubborn. If the story has a final, small truth, it is that guardianship of memory is as important as guardianship of money. My grandmother taught me how to be her steward, and I carried it literally and quietly for the rest of my days. The relatives tried to make noise. I kept the ledgers and the witnesses. In the end, the ledgers were heavier. On the porch in late spring, with bulbs pushing up through the thawing soil, I think about how stubborn life is when it insists on blooming. She used to say, "Plant the bulbs and trust the dark." She was right. Plant the facts, water them with patience, and when the truth breaks the surface, it will be unmistakable.